Here we go with Podkin, The Gift of Dark Hollow, and if I'm not mistaken, he just vanished. Swish. The shadow of the falling sword had been quick, but Podkin was quicker. He had stepped into it, thinking of the clutch of bushes behind him, and he was gone. There was a lurch. The world shifted sideways, and suddenly he was looking down on the gorm below, the soft darkness of brambles all about him, their little thorns jabbing into his flesh. Not that he minded. Being jabbed by bramble thorns was a lot better than being jabbed by an iron broadsword. He peeped out from between the leaves, almost laughing out loud when he saw Scaramshank shout out in surprise and rage. All his gorm warriors began to look around them, frantically trying to see where he'd gone. All very good and most satisfying. But what now? His friends were still captured, Paz and Puck were still in danger. He couldn't just sit up here in the brambles forever. Brambles. A vision popped into his head like a wonderful magical bubble. A memory of him and Paz in the graveyard outside Dark Hollow when he had first shown her Moonfire and jumped her into the bramble bush. She was down there now, and here was another lot of brambles. Would it work again? Were there enough shadows down there for him to use? These were vital questions, but there was no time now. He just had to pray that it would work. Pray and trust the goddess. Podkin looked down at where Paz was standing. He stared at the shadow the moon was casting on the ground beside her. He focused all his attention on that patch of darkened grass and jumped. Swish! From the bramble bushes to Paz's side, in a fraction of a heartbeat, Podkin heard a shout go up from the gorm, and when he flicked into view, but he was too busy grabbing tight hold of his sister. He held a picture of the bramble bushes in his head, and as he grasped her and jumped again, swish, back in the brambles. This time Paz was beside him, down there on the spot they had been standing. In just a blink ago, 3 spears were sticking out of the ground, juddering from their sudden impact. Podkin, what? Paz started to speak, but he slapped a paw over her mouth. Shh, he hissed. It was the moon brooch. I jumped through the shadows like before. Paz looked around her, seeing the brambles everywhere, and down below the gorm horde with Yarrow and Puck, now the only ones out of their clutches. Of course, she whispered back. But what do we do now? They still have all the others. Podkin pointed to the bushes that enclosed them. Thick, ancient bushes that had been here almost as long as the tomb, their roots growing through the rocks to drink the cool lake water around them. Use the sickle, he said. Wrap the gorm up like you did before. They can't stand it. There's enough brambles here to capture the lot of them. Yes, you genius. Paz kissed him quickly on the forehead, then pulled Elfew from her belt. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply a few times, and then focused. Maybe it was the ancient power that had in that sacred site. Maybe it was the full moon, higher and brighter than Podkin had ever seen it before. Maybe it was just that Paz was very, very angry. Whatever the reason, the vines and brambles she summoned were thicker, faster, and fiercer than any of those she had called so far. They tore out of the patchy earth with explosions of gritty soil and reared up like striking cobras, before lashing out to whip themselves around the gorm. Thwip, thwip. They coiled around legs and arms, smacking armored bodies into each other with clangs like bells pealing. The gorm screamed and wailed as the living greenery touched them, as if it burnt through their thick plating. Podkin gasped as he watched, a forest of spiky tendrils snapping and scraping as they pinned every single warrior to the spot. Scaramshank himself was wrapped over and over from his feet to the tips of his horns, bound like a mummy with only his hateful red eyes gleaming out of the layers of thorns. Gradually, the screaming stopped as the brambles slowed their growth. Just the odd tendril could be seen slithering now, tightening, squeezing, crushing the air out of their prisoners until the island was covered with frozen green statues. Iron gorm spikes jutted out next to the bramble thorns. Weapons fell out of bound hands, and Zarza, Mash, and Crom were dropped by their captors, falling to the floor in heaps. When he was sure every gorm was completely trapped, Podkin tapped Paz on the shoulder. She came out of her trance with a gasp and looked down on her work, blinking her eyes in surprise. There was so much, she murmured. It was so powerful. Quickly, said Podkin, before they break free. They hurried out of the bramble bushes, tearing their cloaks and scratching their fur, and ran down the slope from the tomb. When Puck saw them, he went crazy, shouting, "Pod, Pod, Paz!" Jarl followed his gaze and cried out in surprise. Podkin thought he heard him murmuring something about the stories of all stories as he dashed past, but there was no time to stop and talk. Paz ran to Krom and Zarza, ready to tend their wounds. Mash was already turning the big warrior over, rummaging in his backpack for bandages. Podkin headed for the bristling green statue that was Scaramshank. It took all his courage to walk up to him, trapped as he was, but Surestrike was still clutched in his hand, wrapped all around with brambles now. The Gorm Lord made a kind of shrieking groan as Podkin stepped closer. His red eyes stared down with utter hatred at the small rabbit, but he didn't seem able to speak. Perhaps the brambles had wormed their way inside his mask, pushing past his lips and down into his throat. Podkin hoped so. It had hurt like hell, too. "No!" Scaramshank growled. Podkin tapped at the Gorm's outstretched hand with Starclaw. It trembled as Scaramshank tried to pull it away. "I can't cut through the iron," Podkin thought, "but there might be a gap or a joint somewhere I could squeeze Starclaw in there." He had cut off Scaramshank's foot before, but that had been in blind panic and over in a split second. Could he really saw through another rabbit's arm in cold blood? He didn't think so. But then again, he couldn't leave the hammer either. Podkin looked at it again, clutched in Scaramshank's hand. The head was beautifully cast bronze, sparkling and glinting in response to Starclaw being near it. He dare not cut that either. What if it stops Surestrike from working? But the shaft, that was just wood. Could he slice through that? Would the goddess mind too much? He decided she would mind more if the Gorm took the hammer. With a quick flick of his blade, he snipped Surestrike's head free, and it fell into his hands. Scaramshank screamed, his whole body trembling in fury. Podkin flinched, but then realized something. He wasn't terrified anymore. His feet had stopped telling him to turn and run. Instead, he was filled with a kind of calm pride. Podkin held up Surestrike's head to where Scaramshank could see it. He moved it so it twinkled in the moonlight. "See this?" he said. "It's mine now. I've beaten you once now, and I've done it again. I am not a little runt. I am Podkin One-Ear. I am Podkin Moonstrider. I am Podkin the Gift-Bearer, and I'm not afraid of you any more. In fact, it is you who should be afraid of me." Scaramshank roared at this so loudly, he began to choke. Podkin waited for him to finish. "I am taking my friends and going now, and I'm going to cut the bridge down behind me. You can stay on this island and rot." And with that, he went to help Paz and the others carry Krom and Zarza over the bridge and off Ancient's Island forever. Ooh, interlude. We're moving on to an interlude. I'll see you tomorrow.
Bye. Bye.